All right. Want to welcome everybody out this afternoon. Hope that you enjoyed your day, enjoyed this beautiful, crisp fall weather. I think it's here to stay for now. Usually right around Claire's birthday is when that first cold snap hits. That's kind of permanent. And so looking forward to some cooler temperatures and seeing the changes in the leaves and seeing how the Lord just paints that canvas every single year in Kentucky. It's a great time of year to be in the bluegrass, and I love it. But I'm glad that you all came out tonight. I know that this topic is probably not amongst the more popular with some folks, just because it tends to be one of the more enigmatic topics, and that is the minor prophets. We're going to talk about the reason for that a little bit tonight, and maybe see if we can't demystify a little bit of the prophets before we get into this. As Dempsey mentioned, the elders have asked me to cover the prophets Jonah and Habakkuk. Now, if you are familiar with those prophets, they are very, very different prophets. They went to different kingdoms, they lived at different times, and they had very different reactions to their call. So we're going to talk about that. But if you came in tonight expecting to dive right into Jonah, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. I know that you all wanted to talk about Jonah and the fish and get straight into that because that's the fun Bible story. And we're going to talk about how that's not quite the fun Bible story that we make it out to be in kids' Bible class, and why that is, and why Jonah is so much more. But again, with the minor prophets, let's get interactive here. And we did this with the book of Leviticus too, if you remember, when we started going through this. But I want to ask questions about why are the minor prophets so difficult? We'll study the kingdoms all day long. As depressing as they are, and as they get, especially as we get to the middle and the end of the divided kingdoms, we're just ready to be done with the minor prophets and head right on into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Why do we dislike studying the prophets so much? What makes it so difficult? What do you think? What's that? Language. Okay, so there's some enigmatic language in there. And when you say language, clarify what type of language? Okay, yeah, so we had a narrative storyline basically in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and then 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, granted, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a repeat, but it's a story. And we have an easy time following a story. We love a story. But then we get into the prophets. Now, some of the prophets do have stories, right? You've got Daniel. There's a story being told before we get to the heavy stuff at the end. You got Jonah, which we're going to talk about, which is itself a story about a prophet. Okay? Some of the other prophets, we'll get glimpses of Isaiah. We'll get glimpses of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and things happening there. But then we get to those parts where they start talking about the visions, and that gets tricky. That gets real tricky real fast. And so we're just sitting there thinking, what does this mean? What are all these images? Any other hard parts about the prophets? I think that's a main one right there.
It sort of goes with it, but it's chronology, like wondering, where does this fit?
Yeah. The way the Old Testament is laid out, the reason we call them, why do we call them the major and the minor prophets? Are some of them less important than others? Oh, how fat they are. That's a good way to put it. All right, how chunky those books are. All right, you got big Isaiah, you got big Jeremiah. Those are the main two big ones. And then you start getting into these little bitty prophets. I mean, you got a book like Obadiah that in itself is only one chapter and only a few verses at that. Okay, so Obadiah is basically like the 2nd John of the Old Testament. Nahum and Amos and all these things. So, yeah, but it's all out of order. I mean, with the exception of those last three, right? Those are definitely the last ones, and they basically fall in that order. But all the other ones are jumbled all over the place. We don't know if this one's to Israel or this one's to Judah, or if they're going to Nineveh, or if they're going to Edom, or wherever we're going. And we've covered that in our spiritual heritage and talked about that some. But they're out of order. And so how do we know who's being spoken to and what's being spoken about, and taking those images and that difficult language and applying it to what? I don't know. It's all messed up. Okay, that's a good one. All right, so chronology. Any others?
We tend to study things we're familiar with.
Okay.
So it's kind of a repeating cycle.
Yeah.
We don't know it real well, so we don't really want to study it. And then we know it less, and then we want to study it less.
Especially those things, again, that we talk about in kids' Bible classes, right? We learn our Bible stories. So we learn about Abraham, and then Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we learn about Moses, and then we learn about Joshua and David, and then some of the kings, and then Jonah, basically, and Daniel. The rest of it we're highly unfamiliar with. Even I keep mentioning them, but even Isaiah and Jeremiah, we tend to be very unfamiliar with those books and kind of where they fit and what they're doing. So yeah, familiarity, that's a big one. If I don't know what's in this book, and if I don't know who this person is and where they came from, that's hard for me to deal with. Now, what's funny is we're okay with Elijah, who just kind of pops up out of nowhere. But then again, we get to Obadiah, we get to Nahum, we get to Habakkuk, and we're like, these guys got weird names, and I don't know who they're talking to or what they're talking about. And so I'm not familiar with them, and therefore I feel like I don't need to study them. Any others? These are all great. And I think these are some of the major ones. Brian. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Yes, I agree with you 100%. And I think that is one of the top reasons. If you didn't hear what Brian said, it's the negativity in the prophets. It's so hard to read about all the bad things that Israel is doing and has done, and then especially what's about to happen to them. Okay, and so when we read about that negativity, what becomes our view of the scriptures? What do we think about them? Negative, yeah. Okay, I mean, you don't want to be around a sourpuss all day long, do you? You don't like being around those types of people that they've been weaned on a dill pickle and their mouth is always turned down. We just don't like we like being around positive people, and we like hearing about positive things. And so again, we want to skip to the Gospels. We want to hear about the good news. Stop giving me all this bad stuff. And so, I feel like you all just set me up. We had 4 things there. So I had my 1, 2, 3 batter, and then Brian came in and cleanup hitter, knocked a home run. I think those are the 4 major reasons that it's so hard for us to study the prophets. Exactly right. This is interesting. This was Martin Luther's view. The prophets have a queer way of talking, like people who, instead of proceeding in an orderly manner, ramble off from one thing to the next, so that you cannot make head or tail of them or see what they are getting at. This is the Reformation, folks. This is the guy that sparked the Reformation. But quite honestly, Martin Luther was a straight shooter. I will give you that. He never shied away from expressing his opinion. And this, I think, tends to be our opinion. So it's not just, as Nate mentioned, the chronology of the books themselves and where do they fall. When we're reading the books, it's like, well, we're going from this image to this image and this topic to this topic, and I don't understand how any of this fits together. Now, luckily, Jonah is a book that kind of flows from one to the next. Again, it's a narrative. And even Habakkuk will kind of flow from one point to the next. But some of these prophets, And some of the things that they're writing down and giving to us seem so disjointed. And so it's hard to follow and see any consistency or roadmap to what they're getting at. So in a similar way, and if you remember, if you were in the Leviticus class, these are almost the exact same things you told me about why it's so hard to study Leviticus, minus the chronology. You know exactly where Leviticus fits. But the language, why we need all those laws, you know, what's being said, why it goes from one topic to the next, and they're seemingly unconnected. And so as we did in Leviticus, I want to try to bring some cohesion, not just to each prophet in and of themselves, but to the prophets as a whole. Okay, so we're going to do a little overview this evening, and then we will dive straight into Jonah next time. So be reading Jonah. I think the entire book is only like 48 verses. 4 chapters make up 48 verses. So it's not going to take you long to read it and reread it and reread it. But I want to talk about the prophets today and maybe give us a sense of what they're trying to do. Okay, this whole section of the Bible, the minor prophets offer a compelling portrayal of God through vivid and dramatic metaphors. I think we can all agree on that. A lot of imagery in the prophets. And these quotations that I'm about to go through all come from this book. It's called The Message of the 12. The 12 refers to the 12 minor prophets. Interesting that there are 12, right? Haven't made it all the way through this book yet, but what I've read so far is very, very informative. Okay. The Message of the 12 is by guys named Richard Allen Fuhr Jr. and Gary E. Yates. And I'll be happy to let anybody look at this if they want to afterwards. But this is what they said in the introduction to this book. The minor prophets offer a compelling portrayal of God through vivid and dramatic metaphors. In judgment, which is exactly to get to Brian's point, the negativity, right? In judgment, the God of Israel is like a fierce warrior coming down and exacting vengeance and justice upon the nations. He's like a roaring lion. Always great if he's on your side, but if you meet him out, you don't want to tangle with that. He's considered to be a raging whirlwind, right? We see that in some places. We see that in the book of Job in some places. He's considered to be a consuming fire. A lot of fire imagery in the minor prophets, especially towards the latter end of the 12. And yet, the same prophets who employ these frightening images also assure us that in his work of salvation, because that's what's happening, God's work of salvation, the Lord is also a faithful husband. He's also a loving father. He's a healer who restores. And he's a shepherd who's compassionate. Okay? So I think the minor prophets get a bad rap. Yes, there's a lot of negativity there, but there's a lot of positive too. We just have a hard time seeing it through the negative. Okay? So all of this imagery is there. Yes, God is an avenging warrior. Yes, he's a consuming fire. Yes, there is a healthy amount of fear that we should have for the Lord. Kevin talked about that this morning. But there's also these positive images that have been throughout the entire Old Testament and continue into the New. Because all of these things are also what Jesus was and is. Okay? We've got to see that. So if we're going to skip towards the Gospels, we're going to miss some things. The prophets remind us that God cannot be pushed to the margins of our lives, or be trivialized, or be manipulated into fulfilling our personal agendas. That is limiting God. Instead, The prophets restore a vision of God's immensity and challenge us to worship and to revere him above all else. That's what their point is. That's what God sent them to do to the nations. Okay, so I want to focus on that last statement right there, to revere him above all else. And I want to look at a period in Israel's early history. As a matter of fact, the very beginning of Israel as a nation. Let's consider an instance where God's people did not revere him, but turned from him. And then let's see God's response to that. And what I think you're going to see as we go through this is we're going to see a pattern develop. Okay? We're going to see how God's people, even at the very outset of God's covenant with them, have turned away from him, and yet he is the faithful, compassionate God who will always be there for his people if they will just turn to him and trust him. Turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 34, please. Exodus chapter 34. You're probably familiar with where we're going. Exodus chapter 34, just to set up what we're going to talk about today. Let's rock step and kind of give some background for what's happening here. So in Exodus chapter 19 through 31, Moses goes up the mountain, Mount Sinai, to mediate the covenant between God and Israel. Now keep in mind, Israel's been at Mount Sinai for about a year now. You know, we tend to think like in the Cecil B. DeMille version that they came out and they went straight to the mountain and then Moses got the commandments and everything was hunky-dory. That's not the case. They were there for some time. Okay, so when Moses leaves and goes up onto the mountain, Moses is up there for give or take about a month, 40 days and 40 nights, right? And so they're sitting down there wondering they say it out loud. We don't know what's happened to this Moses. So we got to start doing some actions now. Okay, so that's where we are in Exodus 19 through 31. Moses is up on the mountain with God, receiving the law. He's learning about the tabernacle. He's establishing the covenant. Exodus chapter 20 is the 10 commandments and everything that goes along with that. Okay, so in Exodus chapter 32 then, here's where the problem happens. As the covenant is being established, Israel creates an idol statue of a calf, breaking the first commandment of the agreement. So Moses is up there. Commandment number 1, do not make an idol. What's the first thing they do? They make an idol. You wonder why it's commandment number 1, right? Now, granted, you might say well, they didn't have the commandments yet. You know, Moses hadn't brought the tablets back down yet. But they're making an idol. They're going back to the very thing that God just brought them out of. You know what? The problem in Egypt was not just that Pharaoh was oppressing the people and putting them under backbreaking labor. The problem in Egypt was that Egypt is an idolatrous nation that has put them into oppression. And so they are looking at the Egyptians and saying, these guys are in power. These guys are the top of the pyramid, if you'll excuse the expression. And they're worshiping these idols and these pagan gods. So that must mean if I worship the idols and the pagan gods, and I follow the Egyptians, then I'll be at the top of the pyramid. This is a problem. God brings them out and he shows them who he is. And he's already shown them at this point through the plagues that he is superior to both Pharaoh, who believed himself a god, and to all the individual gods of the Egyptians, because that's mainly what the plagues represent, right? That God is superior over all those aspects of creation. All right. So as the covenant is being established, Israel creates an idol statue of a calf, breaking that first commandment. This is like if you are at your wedding, you are getting married to your spouse, and your spouse, while you're in the middle of the vows, you know, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, and all those things in the middle of the I do's, he now turns over to the bridesmaid and says, no, this isn't my wife. This is now my wife. And she's going to have your name, by the way, because that's what they did. They didn't just create a foreign god. They created an idol and called it God, like the God that brought them out of Israel. Don't miss that fact. They're not creating something else. They're creating God in an image that they wanted, something that's more palatable to them. And so again, this is like, I'm sorry, Susan, or, Jessica, or whatever you want her name to be. She is now Jessica, and I'm going to take her to be my wife. Sorry, don't know anything about you. How would that make you feel? How would that make you feel? That's hard, isn't it? That's what they're doing to God in the midst of the covenant ceremony. Okay, so Exodus chapter 33 then. What's Moses' response? All right, well, God tells them what they're doing. He tells them they've made this calf statue and they're down there worshiping it. And so Moses intercedes 5 times for Israel. Now, this is important because remember, we're setting a precedent for a lot of the things that are happening. But Moses is also setting a precedent. What Moses is doing is he's setting a precedent for an intercessor, someone who will step in and request the punishment that Israel is due. Moses gets a bad rap for potentially writing in the Pentateuch that Moses was the humblest man on earth. If he did write that, he's not lying. Because Moses said, Lord, put their sin on me. Take me in their place. That's big. Can any of us say that? Right? Scarcely would a man die for a sinful person. Moses says, put it on me. And he intercedes with the Lord 5 times on their behalf. And he's able to persuade the Lord to relent from most of the punishment. All right, now, of course, we have Moses, telling the Levites to come to him, and then the Levites exact retribution right then and there. Let's call it justice. Maybe retribution is a bad word. Exact justice on the instigators. And they go through with swords, and they're cutting down their countrymen, is what they're doing. And then, not only have we got the Levites, but Moses is interceding. He's asking the Lord to show his glory. Yes.
And God had offered that he was going to make Moses become Abraham.
Yes.
And he would be the father of
That's also true. I didn't think about that. That's also a good point, Eddie, that God actually offered for Moses to just start over, to just completely start over with just Moses. I'll make a nation out of you, and that way my covenant will still be kept through the Abrahamic line. So that's a very good point. But Moses says, no, Lord. Okay, if the nations hear about this, they're not going to believe that you're the Lord. They're going to think that you went back on your word. So please, Lord, don't do this. And so the Lord relents. And so Moses intercedes these 5 times, and he asks the Lord to relent and to further reveal himself and to show his glory. Now, that's a big ask. That's a big ask. But if anybody can make it at this point, it's Moses. And so in Exodus chapter 34, at the end of 33 and into 34, we see when Moses ascends the mountain again with new tablets. Now remember, when Moses went up before, God made the tablets. But Moses has to carry those things back up into the mountain. Talk about bearing a weight, okay, a literal weight. When Moses ascends that mountain again with the new tablets, God grants his request, descending onto the mountain and proclaiming his glory. So remember, this is the part where God says, you're not going to see my glory, but you'll see my backside, and I will shelter you in the cleft of the rock as I pass by. And that's what he does. And we see a mirror of that in Elijah, by the way, later on. But God grants this request. This is a big thing, because not only is God giving his name to Moses, he's allowing his glory to pass by. Remember when Moses comes down from the mountain, his face is shining because of this, in being in the presence of God. All right. Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7 is what I want to focus on for the rest of our time. Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. not only does God pass by, but God makes a proclamation as he passes by. And this is what he says: Jehovah, Jehovah, God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loyal love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. Now, what tends to happen in this passage, first of all, remember who's talking. This is not somebody writing about God. This is not David waxing poetic or Moses, kind of having an inner monologue here. This is God himself speaking about himself. So God is revealing more and more about himself to Moses. And what he says about himself is these 5 characteristics: compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loyal love and faithfulness. Okay, I want to focus on those 5 characteristics. Now, what we tend to do with this passage is we say, yeah, the first part's good, but the last part is where my focus goes. What's this thing about the children's children to the third and the fourth generations? What is God holding sin against innocent people and things like that? Don't miss the first part to help explain the latter part. Now, first of all, one of the things I want you to key in on here, there's a chiasm here. Everybody, that's hard to see, isn't it, in the sun? I'll try to do a better job of that next time. Everybody remember what a chiasm is? That was one of Sid's favorite things. That whenever you've got a piece of poetry or a song or a prophecy, a lot of the times you'd have this like ABBA structure, right? So the sun is shining and the day is beautiful and the grass is growing and the light is shining on all. Okay, so you've got this kind of ABBA, right? That's kind of what's happening here. So in the first part, notice, keeping steadfast love for thousands. That's the part we skip over when we just go straight to the end. His steadfast love is kept for thousands and thousands. And so this is this large number. But then visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the grandchildren to the third and the fourth generation. And so what's happening here is he's saying, my love and compassion is for thousands and thousands. But this small group will experience my wrath if they turn away from me. Because typically what would happen is one generation would fall away, and then what would happen to the next generation? Any of my readers of the book of Judges out here? Oh, what's that? Well, think about the overall structure of Judges. They got worse and worse and worse, right? If one generation gets worse, chances are, without some sort of intervention, the next generation is going to get worse, and the next generation is going to get worse. And so there's this natural progression, or regression, I guess I should say, of God's people. And I think that's what he means by to the third and the fourth generation. And again, that's in comparison to thousands and thousands. All right. So let's look at some of these characteristics. This particular passage is quoted more than 20 times in the Old Testament, more than any other passage in the Bible. This is literally the most quoted passage in Scripture. We might think about John 3:16. We can quote that one. We figure lots of people can quote that one. Or we might even think of judge not lest you be judged. Everybody quotes that. But in terms of quoting within the Bible itself, this is the most repeated thought, often word for word, in the entire Bible. And you can see all these 20 places, and they cover a variety of different places. You got Numbers in the beginning of the Bible. You've got 2 Kings in that narrative portion we talked about. You got Daniel in the prophetic portion. You've even got Lamentations. This passage is mentioned. Lamentations is a funeral dirge for Jerusalem. And it's mentioned here too, in Lamentations 3. Okay, so this passage, I think we can agree, very important, right? These character traits that we just mentioned are precisely the ones that drive God to keep his covenant relationship with Israel in spite of their continual corruption and betrayal. They are almost always quoted throughout the Old Testament in connection to a description of the covenant being broken. So we have this contrast then between God's character and Israel's character. All right? If the law and the prophets, as Jesus kind of brought out in his teaching, if the law and the prophets are the framework for God's eternal plan, then this proclamation about God by God is the heartbeat of God's plan. This is what John 3:16 means. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. This passage is carried out in Jesus. We'll talk about that more in just a second. And so we must understand God's perspective through this lens, through the lens of these characteristics, in order to understand what he is accomplishing through the prophets. That is going to be the barrier to that. I don't want to look at this because it's all just bad news. What is God ultimately trying to do through the prophets? What is this bad news, this discipline trying to do? And I think if we read the book of Hebrews, we can safely say that we have a good idea. Hebrews chapter 12, right? The Lord disciplines those whom he loves. All right, so that's what's happening. So we must understand God's perspective through this lens in order to understand what he's accomplishing through the prophets on behalf of the people who turned their backs on him. You ever discipline children and you use that phrase, this is going to hurt me worse than it's going to hurt you? I think God feels that exact same way. As bad as the things are that you're going through, this hurts me worse that I'm having to do it to you and that you've made it necessary for me to get to this point. Okay, I think that's his perspective. So let's keep that perspective in mind as we're going through not just Jonah and Habakkuk, but all the prophets. Okay, so I want to cover some of these. I want to cover these 5 terms. We're going to go through them fairly quickly. So if you want any notes, I'll be happy to provide those, but they're not all going to be up on the screen. All right. So first of all, God mentions that he is compassionate, and that is the word rahum. Rahum. You got to get your chas in your Hebrews, right? When you're studying Hebrews, you got to get your chas. Rahum. Okay. 99 times in the Old Testament, this term is used. And it's connected with the root word, which I found interesting. I never heard this before. The word rechem, which is womb, where a baby is housed and produced and nurtured until the time that it can be born. Womb. And that kind of makes sense. It evokes God's tender care for his children, right? And his affection for his children, that natural affection that a mother has for her child. The word, I think, then as such, conveys strong emotion. You know, not only have you got a literal attachment as a mother to this child, you have an emotional attachment. I mean, I've never given birth. Gonna throw that out there. I've been told that it's an emotional experience, right? I see a lot of mothers crying after it's over. Now, that may just be sheer relief. I don't know, but it's an emotional experience. It's a roller coaster, right? Not just the event itself, but everything leading up to it. Okay, so this word conveys strong emotion. This is the word that's used when Joseph meets Benjamin for the first time. Remember, it says that Joseph was there in front of his brothers. They didn't know who he was yet. And he was overcome with emotion so that he had to leave because he was so distraught. He was so overwhelmed with emotion. Same word, rahum. The true mother reacts to her child when we read about Solomon, right? In 1 Kings chapter 3, when there's the test between the mothers that are fighting over the child. The true mother, when Solomon says, bring the child here, bring me a sword, and I will cut him in two, and you can both have a piece of it. The reaction of the real mother that lets Solomon know who the real mother is rahum. It's compassion. It's a strong feeling for that child. Okay? 80% of the Old Testament usage of this word refers to God himself. We'll have compassion or lack of compassion in terms of mankind, but compassion is one of the main descriptors of God as a loving parent. Now, it's often describing God's response to his people crying out in suffering. This is the way that he felt when he heard his people in Egypt as they were crying out, and the various other times that they cried out to him. And sometimes it's contrasted with anger, representing a turning away from anger. I turned away from anger because I had a compassion and a natural affection for my people. Okay, so again, one of the main descriptors of God is a loving parent. Isaiah 49, Psalm 103, Jeremiah 31. And so, we sometimes see God withholding that compassion for a set time. And it's always for a set time. It's never permanent. God has to withhold that compassion, sending his people into exile. And he mentions that very thing in Isaiah 27, Isaiah 27:11. He doesn't leave them in that state, though, choosing to end their estrangement and their suffering. If you want a New Testament example, this, I believe, is what the father feels when the prodigal son comes back home. There's that natural affection, and that's why he's running out to meet his son. Okay, so that is rahum, compassion. Next word, gracious, chanun, okay? More than 200 times in the Old Testament, the word gracious is used. Now, we think of gracious and we think of it in terms of being a gracious host, right? Someone who's generous, someone who is kind and welcoming. And that's part of it. That is part of it. It's connected to the root word chen, meaning elegant or charming or eliciting a response of favor. Okay? So someone who is gracious makes you want to like them or respond positively to them. That's why we think of something as gracious or beautiful. And the idea behind the word isn't that it has inherent beauty, not because there's physical beauty or things like that, although that is the case in some cases, like in Esther and Ruth. But it's not necessarily talking about inherent beauty or elegance of the thing itself, but of the favorable feelings that it generates in the observers. Okay, so let's kind of give a modern example. All right, you go to your child, and this is not my children, so I'm just using this as an example, but you go to your children's third grade choir concert, and they break out the recorders. How does that make you feel in the moment? Okay. But then they say, and after the concert tonight, we're taking up donations for our music program so that we can buy more recorders and we can instruct more kids, and more kids can be a part of things and be included. All right. Now, in the moment, you might be thinking, this is rough. But because it's your child, and because you recognize what the teacher's trying to do, you see what's happening. And of course you say, well, my child is the best one, right? I mean, they're doing the best job. It makes you want to then give to that program because you want something better for it. It evokes a favorable response in you, okay? So that's basically what's happening. And so that's why when Esther goes before the king, I'm sure the king had lots of beautiful women around him. But when Esther goes before the king, it is her graciousness that causes him to extend his staff and allow her to come. It elicits a favorable response. All right. So chen most often appears in the phrase, let me find favor in the eyes. Let me find favor in your eyes. And that's various places. I think it's like 47 times in the Old Testament, somebody says something to that effect. And in each instance, a vulnerable person or a person of lower status is shown favor by a person of higher status, even though the higher individual isn't under any obligation to do so. Okay, so you think about Jacob and Esau, right? When they meet back up again. Esau has every right to wipe Jacob's family from the face of the planet for what he did. But Esau shows favor to his brother. Okay, so this is Joseph in the eyes of Potiphar. This is Ruth in the eyes of Boaz, having favor in the eyes. That is chanun, or graciousness. All right. So the third one, slow to anger, erek apayim. 12 times in the Old Testament, this particular anger is a whole lot more, but this particular phrase, slow to anger. 12 times in the Old Testament, 9 of them refer to the Lord and 3 of them refer to the characteristics of wise men in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Okay? And slow to anger, this one's an interesting one. I hope you'll probably find this one funny as I did. That phrase, slow to anger, is actually a translation of an idiom, of a turn of phrase. The words erek apayim mean long of nose. The word that's often translated anger in the Old Testament actually can also mean nose. It's kind of crazy. Or large of nostril. How about that one? That's a good one. So not like Pinocchio, long of nose, but let's see if we can't kind of extrapolate this a little bit. Now, it usually gets translated as long suffering or something to that effect, slow to anger. A common Hebrew phrase for anger, and I think we see it sometimes, is his nose became hot. His nose became hot. And so we're going to read about God's hot nose. And what's that referring to? Well, I think if we just think about it, what happens to your face when you get real angry? Especially if you're of the fairer complexion. What happens to your face when you get angry? It gets red. It gets real red, right? And generally it starts around the nose, and your nostrils start flaring, and you start breathing harder, and you're getting ready to yell and vent, okay? That's what's happening, okay? So hot nose or long of nose, okay? So what does this long of nose mean? All right, so we see this 1 Samuel 17 when Eliab gets angry at David for coming out to the battlefield. We see it in Exodus chapter 4 when God gets angry at Moses for making excuse after excuse about not wanting to go on the mission that God's sending him to do. God's anger burned against Moses. His nose was hot against Moses. So the expression then means, long of nose means it takes a long time for your nose to get heated in anger. That's what it means. So God is slow to anger. Now, what is often our perception of God from the Old Testament? What is it? What's our perception of God from the Old Testament oftentimes? He's angry. He's an angry God. Sinners in the hand of an angry God, right? And often when we look at the Old Testament, we say, well, God got angry here, and he's just angry all the time. And then there's Jesus. Oh, thank you for Jesus. Because we got past all that angry God stuff. But that's not what God is saying about himself here. He is slow to anger. Now, think about this. If I took in my lifetime, let's just even call it the last 10 years. Let's call it even the last 3 years. All the times that I got upset and angry to the point of just blood boiling angry sometimes. And I compacted all of that. I think Kevin made an illustration, putting it all up on a board, right? Just compact it all into a real squished in timeline. Now, I know that each of those are separate instances where something happened and it made me upset. But if you see all of that compacted, you're going to say, man, he's an angry person. He's just angry all the time. He's angry here. He's angry here. If he was the guy in the Old Testament, he'd be angry from Genesis all the way to Malachi. What's going on? And that's our perception of God. But what we forget is these are separate instances where God is upset. And so this anger, although sometimes it may build, we have a perception that God is just ready to lightning strike everyone who makes him angry. Now, that does happen sometimes. It does. I'm not shying away from those passages. But God's anger is slow to burn, okay? And so by the time we get often to the point of judgment and the point of justice being enacted, God has given so many chances. So really, if you were to extrapolate that timeline and look out and see all of the evil that's happening through the book of Judges, through the time in the wilderness, all those years, through the kings of Israel, all those years, you would actually say, God's kind of a pushover. You know, if a parent was allowing that with their children, you'd be like, get that kid out of here. Take care of business, man. Get it done, swift. That's how my parents did it. But that's not how we think of God, is it? We think of God as swift to execute, swift to drop the gavel. And that's not what he does. God is slow to anger, okay? And I think even today, we have that perception of him sometimes. If I do one thing wrong, God's mad at me and I'm on the outs. Well, thank God I have a Savior, right? Who advocates for me as Moses did for the people. God is slow to anger. All right, I promise we're going to get through these last two. Sorry, I'm also slow of speech. So, loyalty, loyal love. All right, this is a word that you may have heard before, chesed. I know I've said it in a class before. Chesed. Okay, chesed, 245 times in the Old Testament, this term is used. And most often it is in the translated as loving kindness or steadfast love or even mercy. God's mercy is called chesed. Okay, chesed, you know, we always talk about, whenever we talk about love in church, we always talk about how the Greeks had different words for love, right? We got phileo love, we got agape love, we got all kinds of love. This particular term, chesed, is not the I fell in love with Israel and so I carried them out of Egypt. Like God didn't have a sudden like, oh, there's that Israel, let me make a nation out of them. That's not what's happening. And I don't think that's what happened with Noah or Abraham. That was a long burn for them to be faithful to the Lord. Okay, so chesed assumes a long-term relationship and refers to actions that demonstrate loyalty to that relationship, to preserve it, to protect it, and to make it flourish. This is what we should be doing in our marriages. This is what we should be doing in our parent-child relationships. This is what we should be doing as brethren. We should have chesed, loyal love for one another. And if we did that, there would be a lot less problems in the church, I think. Okay, so it's not any one action, but an attitude that's expressed in many different consistent acts. This is the main idea that's in play in the book of Hosea, if we ever get to that. So in terms of God's chesed, it's expressed in these ways. First of all, maintaining the stability of creation that sustains life. God's chesed is the motivation for keeping this world going and making sure that we don't degenerate into chaos. Okay, we forget that. Forgiving the sins of his people in Psalm 103. God's chesed is the motivation for forgiving, showing goodness to his people and having favor for his people. Psalm 118 talks about that. Not allowing his people to be destroyed. We're going to come back to this one in just a few minutes, but Lamentations chapter 3, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, and therefore I will trust in him. That is God's chesed in the midst of that funeral dirge. All right. And then providing for his people, Genesis chapter 32, and often when his people don't even deserve it. Israel complains in the wilderness about no water, no meat, no those things. Do you think they deserve that? The way they're treating God? No, but he gives it to them anyways. He gives it to them anyways. Okay? And then keeping his word. 2 Samuel chapter 7, we see the promise given to David about a throne that will endure forever. It is God's chesed, his loyal love, that keeps that promise, not just in David's day as Solomon comes to his throne, but also in perpetuity until Jesus can come and reign on his throne. He keeps that promise in the long term because that's what it's about. All right. And the last characteristic, faithful or faithfulness, emet. 329 times in the Old Testament is emet. I think we can agree, not just faithfulness, as in, God chose you and he's loyal to you, or you chose God and you're loyal to him. I think this is a bit more. Let's think broader. To be trustworthy or true, or think about it this way, firm or stable or steady and dependable. I told Amanda, whenever I go, and hopefully it'll be me first, but whenever I go and she's ordering my headstone, I only want one thing to be said on it: steady. That's how I want to be remembered. Steady. Okay? That's what this faithfulness is talking about. Trusting God is the initial step in our relationship with him. Okay? And it's the most vital step to a sustained relationship. If we don't trust God, none of these other things are going to matter. God got angry with me. Well, I don't trust him because he's angry with me. God was gracious to me and gave me, blessed me, but I don't trust him. So these blessings probably come with some sort of drawback, or they're not going to last very long. The faithfulness, the trust in God is the initial when we express belief, and it's the thing that keeps everything going. Okay? It's also the thing that happened in Genesis chapter 3 that went wrong. Eve didn't trust God, and Satan helped to break down that trust in God. And so when he says, did he really say? That's the trust component being taken out. Okay? It's also the thing, it's also the thing that was manipulated in that first sin. And so when someone is trustworthy, when someone isn't trustworthy, they can't be depended on, which destroys relationships. If you can't depend on somebody, again, especially in a marriage relationship, it's destroying that relationship. And so the idea of this trait isn't simply that God is truthful, that he just always speaks the truth, but that he is true. Not just truth, but true. God is true. Remember, that's what Paul writes. Let God be true and every man a liar. God is true, and we have to believe that. Now, modern ideas of truth tend to center around, scientific principles or mathematical equations. 2 + 2, you mathematical theorists out there, you have your thing, but for me, 2 + 2 is always going to equal 4. It's just always going to, right? I can trust in that because that's truth. 2 + 2 is 4. It's true. But this, again, is so much more. Yes, God speaks the truth and does not lie, and he keeps his word. But the idea here is that God is true. So, we tend to assign this word more to objects. We don't say Dan is true. That's just a weird phrase. We might say he's truthful or trustworthy, but not true. Okay, God is true. So, you think in the term of engineering, you're putting a foundation down. That foundation is true. What does it mean for a foundation to be true? Give me a kind of a brief engineering description of that. What does it mean for something to be true? Okay, it's accurate to its purpose, right? So accuracy is a part of it, but the accuracy is meant to lead to something. Something else is going to be built on top of that. So God is true. So when things are firm, when they're established, when they're able to hold up to scrutiny or pressure, other things can be measured or stabilized by a true object. A cornerstone in a building should be true, because if it's not, the rest of the building is going to be off kilter. That's the whole point of a cornerstone. Okay? Other things can be measured or stabilized by the true object. It becomes the standard for other true things. So when something else is being evaluated, you can always refer back to the original true thing. So God is true. So in that light, we can see the importance of emet in a covenantal relationship, right? If we're establishing a covenant, we need to base that covenant on something. You might love your spouse, and you probably loved them when you all got married, but it's a little bit more. You had to trust them. You had to believe that they were true and that you could rely on them and build a relationship on your time together. That's what's happening. Okay, so God will remain true to the terms of the covenant, even if man will not. And so because of this, God's part in the covenant will always remain open and receptive for the relationship to be restored. Even if we are not true to God, and even if we are not truthful about God, he is always there being true to his word and true himself. And so he's always receptive to us if we will simply turn to him. If God was not true, that would make him inconsistent. And it would, as we often think of him, sometimes from the Old Testament, we talked about that, it would make him volatile. I can't, I don't know what God's going to do. I don't know what he's going to look like in this situation. Well, the God that I see in the Bible, from Genesis through Malachi to Matthew through Revelation, is true the whole way. He does not change. And what he said in Malachi chapter 3, one of the very last words he gives to his people before the promised one comes 400 years later, before he's silent and Jesus comes, one of the last things he says is, in Malachi 3, we see the unfaithfulness of Israel's leadership to their spouses, and then there's a contrast. And God says, because I, the Lord, do not change, because I am true, I am faithful, you are not destroyed. You, children of Jacob, descendants of Jacob, have not been destroyed. You can always turn to me. And so the very last thing we see in the Old Testament is turn to the Lord. The very first thing we see in the New Testament is turn to the Lord. Make his path straight because he's coming. Okay, so when we're going through the minor prophets, and I don't know, are we covering more minor prophets than just Jonah and Habakkuk? Okay, so the intent of this is to continue then, yes, okay, that's great. So when we're going through all of these things, and when you don't understand what something means in the prophets, give it the benefit of the doubt in this light, because that's what's happening. And all of the prophets are consistent. Some are going to be more positive, some are going to be more negative, but they weren't all preaching to the same people, right? Some of them were preaching to different groups, different individuals. So their message is obviously going to be a little bit more severe or lighter, depending on who they're talking to. But the message is always the same. It is always consistent. Where there is judgment, there is always a faithful remnant that will turn to the Lord and will be his people. That's what the prophets are designed to do. Okay, I've gone on for a while tonight. Any last thoughts or comments or questions before we close tonight?
At the way God reveals himself.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great way to get a perspective on the prophets.
Great. I just hope that we can remember this when we get into Habakkuk chapter 2, right? Okay, let me stop this.